Hello everyone. In this video we'll be going over how to create the stained glass nightlight with the Dragonfly image on it. All you need are a couple of toothpicks, scraps of paper towel, nightlight base of course, and the paints that are required for this particular kit. One of the things I like to do when I'm creating the nightlights is I will get the shell after it's cut out and I will spray it with gloss coat, a clear. And the reason why I do that is because inevitably when you're applying paint to these areas, you're going to get a little bit of overflow. And you're going to get paint onto the shell that you'll need to wipe off with the toothpicks. It's a lot easier to do that if you close up the pores somewhat with a clear gloss coat. It's not necessary, it's not a requirement, it's just something that I prefer to do. When I first started making these night lights, I didn't do it, and I didn't really have too much of an issue with it. But it is just one of those little things that can make a difference when you're creating the night lights. Anyways, we'll go ahead and start off with the blue in this image. One of the things you'll see me doing a lot of when I'm working on these night lights is I'm constantly rubbing the tip of the bottle up against a paper towel. The reason why I do that is because I want to make sure that there aren't any air bubbles, and I want to make sure that the bottle isn't clogged or starting to dry out a little bit. The last thing you want is to have a clogged bottle, and when you're going to apply the paint onto the nightlight, you squeeze, and all of a sudden the clog lets loose, and then you end up with paint all over everything. It's extremely difficult to clean up, especially from the back of the shell, because that is very dry and it stains very easily with the nightlight paint. Alright. So the only two areas in this nightlight that require blue are these two long spots in the wings, the top wings. So again, rub the blue up against the paper towel, make sure there's no clogs or bubbles, and then I will apply the paint to one tip, the other tip there. And with these narrow cavities, it's pretty easy to just go ahead and run a little bit of paint along the length of the cavity. Now, I know from experience that this dark blue is extremely thick. You almost can't even see through it, even with the light on. So, I'll apply the paint, and then I'm going to take off quite a bit. Now, to do that, all you have to do is, with a clean toothpick, and it's dry, make sure you wipe off any excess paint onto the paper towel. You just dab where you've applied paint with the toothpick, and it'll lift up paint, and then you can see how thick or thin you've left the cavity. Now with blue, I almost always remove most of the paint because it's so dark. The other colors, especially green and purple, you almost have to leave it on a little bit thick because the paint ends up drying really clear. Alright, so again, with this spot, just apply paint to the tip of the cavity, apply paint to the other tip, and then just connect the ends. Again, I will use the dry toothpick to dab up some of that paint. You can see where I've picked up some paint with the toothpick. And then I can use the toothpick tip to even out the paint. I'll be able to see with the light where the thick spots are and where the thin spots are. Alright. So we're done with the blue. That was very straightforward. Next I'm going to go with green, and I'm going to fill the body of the Dragonfly up with the green paint. Again, I'm going to apply some paint onto the paper towel, make sure that it's not clogged, and then I'll do each cavity. Now what you want to do is, the walls of the cavity aren't very visible in the video, but when you're holding the shell in your hand, you can see where the piercings are, and the wall is, of course, about as thin as a dime, maybe even thinner on the emu eggs. But you want to paint the walls of the cavity first, especially on the large cavities. You want to paint the walls like I did there. And then you want to go over it and just let surface tension do its job. There it is right there. Now if you have any excess paint that comes onto the edge of the shell, you can just dab it up with a clean toothpick. But that's pretty good right there. It's not too thick or too thin. And then just proceed to the next one. This one here has a little bit of a horseshoe shape instead of an oval. So what I want to do is the same thing I did with the head. I'm going to apply paint to the very ends there, and then paint the walls. And there you go. One of the things I like to do is I keep a lamp handy so that when I am applying the paint, I can look at it like that up against the light of the lamp, and I can tell where the thick spots are and the thin spots are. It's easier to tell against light than it is just looking down on it like this. So when you look at it against the light in that way, you can see that that cavity close to the head is a little bit thinner than towards the tail. So I will just simply dab the paint against a paper towel, make sure there's no bubbles, and then I will drop just a little tiny bit of paint there. And then with the toothpick tip, I will then just spread it out. Sometimes it's not necessary to actually add paint. You can just see where the thick paint is, and then with the tip of the toothpick you can draw it out. But this cavity, I saw that it actually needed more paint added. The smaller cavities, you don't always need to use the bottle up against the cavity like that. Many times you can just go ahead and put a big drop of paint on your paper towel, sop it up with your toothpick, and then apply it. Paint the walls that way. It's a little bit more controlled. And then with your bottle, fill it up. Okay. Other times, if the cavity's small enough, you can get enough paint on your toothpick, you can just completely fill in the entire cavity like that. I'm going to try to do that with the next one too. Now that one had a little bit too much paint on it. You can see that there's actually a dome of paint on there. So I'll just grab some with the toothpick, clean up the edges, and that's that. I don't usually do that because you increase the chances of getting air bubbles in your cavity that you're painting, and sometimes they add, if they're small enough, they add to the realism of the stained glass effect. But I personally don't like air bubbles in my work. Alright, so there I just did that. Touch the ends with some paint. The end with paint there. And then using surface tension, just squeeze the paint till the gap is filled. And then you can check your work up against the lamp to see if it's too thick or too thin. And I just noticed I got an air bubble in there, so I'm going to get rid of that. I was able to pick it up with a toothpick. You probably can't see it there, but I was able to pick up the air bubble with the toothpick. And I need to replace some paint. So I'll squeeze some on the paper towel. Just grab a little dab of paint. And then replace what I took off when I pulled out that air bubble. That's all set. Now we're done with the green. We have to have purple and white, and this nightlight would be done. Some paints tend to dry a little bit faster than others. This dark blue, you want to work with it pretty quickly because the dark blue seems to set up and dry up really fast. Other paints like orange and yellow, you have a little bit more time to work on, but you don't want to decide after a few minutes after the fact, oh, I don't like how much paint is in that cavity, I want to add some, or I want to take some paint off, because it will have already set. So you want to work a little bit quickly when you're making changes to your cavities. Alright, so you saw on this one, all I did was put paint at the very tips of this triangle, and then I just filled it up with surface tension. These smaller cavities are a lot easier. I did videos of a couple of other designs, and some of the cavities were larger, and you had to be a lot more careful with them. But these are pretty forgiving when they're narrow cavities like this. Alright, the next cavity is going to be a very, very narrow, thin-tipped cavity. What I do on something like that is I will apply paint almost to the end. You can see that's not all the way to the very tip. And then with the toothpick, I will just push that paint to the very tip. Now the reason I'm doing that is because that cavity is very close to this one here. If I accidentally drop way too much paint in that tip trying to fill it up with the bottle, it could spill over to this cavity. Now this cavity, you can't see it now in the video, but it's already starting to set on the edges. It's already starting to harden. If you have that big drop spill over onto this cavity here, you're going to have to clean up both cavities and start all over again. So again, on the very, very narrow channels, you can just fill up to the very end, close to the end, and then just use a toothpick to push it to the tip. Alright, here again, just making sure the wall is covered with paint, and then with a little bit of pressure up against the bottle, I will squeeze some paint out and fill up the cavity. Now I know I squeezed a little bit too much paint there, so I could just easily scoop it up at the tip, and then I can see up against the reflection where it's thick and where it's thin. I will even it out, and that cavity is done. And we'll move on to the next one. Before I go to any cavities, you will see me constantly wiping the tip of this bottle onto the paper towel, because I don't want any air bubbles in here. And as I'm working, I'm constantly keeping the tube at a downward angle. Sometimes that could be a problem because the paint, especially if it's really watery, can start to drip out of the tip of the tube of a bottle, and then you can have a mess. But you're always going to want to keep an eye on the tip of the bottle and where your finger placement is on the nightlight. This nightlight doesn't have any kind of cavities along the edges. I purposely, for the ease of a beginner nightlight, stayed away from these edges with cavities, because the radius of the shell will make the paint have a tendency to want to pull down towards the bottom of the shell if you're creating the nightlight like this. And then you end up with a thick spot of the cavity where all the paint went down to while it was wet, and then on the top of that cavity it's really, really thin. Well, when you try to illuminate that with the nightlight, the thin spots won't even have any color. The thick spots will be so thick light won't shine through it. So you want to be very careful of the size of the cavities and the placement of the cavities if you're going to be working towards the edge. Also, you don't want to make it too delicate to where it makes the edge of the shell more vulnerable to a crack or a break. Okay. Now we'll just keep going. This purple's kind of runny, so you'll see me going back and either applying paint or removing paint from these cavities. And then, of course, I can check it up against the lamp there to find out where I'm thick and where I'm thin. Okay? Now, I always like to try to get the very points of the cavities filled with paint first, and then I will go along the long edges. And the reason being is because when you fill those points with paint, it'll round it off. The very tips will end up being rounded, and it's easier to get that surface tension. I hope everything I'm saying here makes sense. I have a tendency to ramble on and repeat myself. The more paint you put on the shell, the more you want to be aware of where you've applied paint and where you haven't. Because if you've worked with eggshells before, you're going to have the natural tendency to want to support the shell from the bottom. And you just can't do that with these, because of course you're going to end up hitting the paint with your fingertips. Always wanting to hold the shell from the edges firmly so it doesn't slip out of your hands, but not so tight to where you end up pinching it and breaking the eggshell. But that's what you want to do. You don't want to support it from the bottom. You don't want to lay it down and try to do that, because it just creates some awkwardness. You want to move the shell to accommodate the bottle of paint. You don't want to move the paint to accommodate the shape of the shell, if that makes any sense. Alright, so we've got that side of the Dragonfly finished with purple and blue. And just repeat the other side. Again, I didn't put that glue paint all the way to the end. I'm going to use the toothpick to do that. This lavender color is coming out a little bit more runny than I would like. That's a good thing because it's easier to get those points filled up, but it's a bad thing because when I'm holding the bottle down, I inevitably get a big dab of paint at the very tip, and I want to be neat about that, especially when I'm filling up points like that are close to the next cavity. With more experience, you'll find out the different tendencies of the shell and the paint and the different colors of the paint. When I create these kits, I try to make them as user-friendly but as beautiful as possible. I simplify some things a little bit, but I still want something that's beautiful to look at and that people are going to smile when they see them. The half shells that I supply with my kits have a pretty good amount of different shapes. There's zigzags, there's ovals, there's circles, rounded squares, lightning bolts. There's a bunch of different shapes on the half shells that I include in these kits so that people can practice in learning the different nuances of the different shapes, and they can get more comfortable with the half shell instead of just jumping right into the nightlight right away. Hopefully they can work out any bugs with the practice shell first, and then they can tackle the nightlight. If you're using a shell that you cut out yourself, sometimes it helps to go ahead and create your own practice shell from scraps with different shapes in it so that you can, again, practice on that before ruining an entire day's or more worth of work if you carve a shape out yourself. Alright, now a lot of these paints, especially if they're runny like the purple, this lavender is, they will start to build up really thick at the very tips where I apply the paint first. So you can see from the light, just the reflection of the lights, that it's thick. So just with the tip of the toothpick, just even it out a little bit. Most night lights that I create, I will paint them over the course of maybe 2 days. The reason being is because I want the colors to have a chance to set up correctly. I'm doing these in a 25-30 minute video, of course, because I'm a little bit pressed for time. I don't want to make a 2-day video for you guys to have to watch, so I'm compressing all the steps really quickly. But ideally, you want to do one half, let it dry, do the body of the dragonfly, let it dry, and then do the other half. When they're done, sometimes I will, after they've dried overnight, I will spray the shell with gloss coat so that the gloss is uniform. But that's just a thing of mine. Anybody else, they wouldn't even notice that it was done. That's just something that I do with my shells. And that, of course, is done before gluing on the nightlight base. Because of this video and because of the time, we're not going to have time to do that because we're going to be gluing the nightlight base on right away. Okay. So we're done with the purple and the green. Now all we have left is white for the moon itself. The moon cavities are a little bit larger, so I'm going to show you a different technique. Again, always make sure that your bottle of paint is free of any clogs. You see there's some dried up paint on the tip. I want to get rid of that. Because what ends up happening is you're going to touch it to your eggshell, and that dried up chunk of paint is going to end up dragging your paint to where you don't want it to go. Looks like someone just came home. The dogs are going crazy. Alright. Now this white, you can see it's very runny. It's dripping, and that is very, very bad. So you have to adjust your approach. I want to make sure that there's no air bubbles in the tip, but once I do that, I will go ahead and angle the tip of the bottle up so that it doesn't drip out all over my work. And then I will just apply the paint the same way I did the other colors. Now you can see where I put too much paint on the edges, so I'll just use a clean toothpick, dry toothpick rather. Doesn't have to be a new one for every single cavity. And then there's a little bit too much paint on there, so I'll just grab some with the tip, thin it out a little bit, and proceed to the next cavity. Again, I want to make sure there's no bubbles in there, and then I'm going to angle the bottle up just a little bit, and then I'm going to fill up the tips. Just like so. And then I'm going to paint the wall. Make sure the wall has paint on it. Being very careful with the angle of my bottle of paint because I know it's very watery and runny. Alright, so those cavity walls have paint on them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the edge of the nozzle and the wall of this cavity to support it as I'm applying paint. All I'm going to do is just put a little bit of pressure, and you can see how I'm really just letting the nozzle rest on that cavity wall. Clean up any excess as always. A little bit thick. Again, this paint is a lot more runny than, say, the blue. So I'm going to remove some, just even it out a little bit, and proceed to the next cavity. Because I'm resting the nozzle up against the walls of those cavities, I'm having some buildup up against the nozzle. So before I apply any paint to the next cavity, I want to make sure and clean that nozzle off very well. Unfortunately, I got an air bubble in there. So you could just carefully try to pull that air bubble out with a toothpick. Not very easy. Sometimes you can pull it out with one try. There we go. I grabbed it. It's the tip of the toothpick there. And then go ahead and just clean it up. Sometimes you'll get some really tiny air bubbles in there. It's not that big of a deal, but it's the big air bubbles that can really ruin the look of your work. And some paints are more susceptible to having air bubbles. I'm not sure why. The yellow and the white seem to have the most air bubbles. There again, I caught another air bubble in the cavity. I was lucky again, I was able to pull that out. almost done with this, and then we can move on to how to glue onto the base. So after this one cavity here, wow, white is being very difficult with this one. Must have gotten a bottle that's just extremely watery. That's okay. Again, that's why I provide the practice shells, so you can see the characteristics of the different paints and the bottles that you got. This white's almost the consistency of milk, whereas the other ones are a little bit more like syrup. I took a little bit too much paint out of that cavity, so all I did was put a drop of paint onto the paper towel, scooped up a little ball of it with a toothpick, and then dropped it into the cavity. If I end up putting too much, I can always just take a little bit more out. Now we're at the home stretch. Now with some paints, if you get a little bit onto the shell here, and you can't clean it completely off, it's not a problem because these paints dry transparent for the most part. So once that